And gentlemen, you're listening to Black Tower Radio. I'm your host, Nathan Ford. Jake Fox is here. We're in BC Studios broadcasting WNRT, World News Radio Today. Go to worldnewsradio.today. We're also broadcasting terrestrial radio, 1040 AM, 92.1 FM, WYSL, Rochester, Buffalo, New York. And we have Mark Watts on the show. What an honor to have Mark Watts doing good work here. Mark Watts, editor-in-chief of Exero. Go to exeronews.com, co-founder of the FOIA Center, which specializes in research using open access laws such as the Freedom of Information Act. The Freedom of Information Act. You got to get that information, though. They just put it out there. Reminds me of the pub record. Who was that?
Yeah, Jason Leopold was labeled a FOIA terrorist by the federal government, actually.
They called him a FOIA terrorist.
That's an honor, really.
Is it? Yeah, it is an honor. Mark Watts, he's a journalist, author, television presenter. He ran the investigations unit at Sunday Business as its chief investigative reporter. He's worked as a reporter on several national newspapers, Sunday Times, The Independent, Sunday Telegraph. He also worked on World in Action, other television current affairs program. Mark Watts, an honor to have you. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Good to be with you.
All right, and now a third witness now. And we've been breaking this down on the show on a daily basis, and we have been following your work, and we have been referencing your work during our conversations. I hope you don't mind. But our listeners do know about the recent developments in Dolphin Square. And we talked about Napier, him going down. Of course, we talk about the Catholic Church. We've talked to Kevin Annett. We've talked about the mass graves in Canada. And we're putting the pieces together. Now, a third witness, Darren, his alias, coming forward, describing the abuse by the members of Parliament and VIPs at Dolphin Square, London. There's an interview on Exero News. Go to exeronews.com that you conduct with Darren. And it is, to say the least, very chilling, and it is disturbing. Darren said he was trafficked by Peter Wrighton, the character Peter Wrighton. If you don't know, Peter Wrighton is a hypocrite of the highest magnitude. And we won't get into that right now. But Darren is describing these parties, these abuse parties with MPs. Time is limited now on the show, and I want you to begin to paint the picture of what these parties are like and what it was like interviewing Darren, now the third witness. Mark Watts, I'm going to let you take it away on the Black Tower Radio.
Well, as you say, Darren is the third witness to talk about the sexual abuse of children, specifically at Dolphin Square, which is an apartment complex near Parliament in the centre of London, where many MPs and other establishment figures have their London homes. We ran a story in July last year based on two witnesses who talked about child sex abuse taking place over many years at Dolphin Square. Now, Darren came forward subsequently, and he talks about remarkably similar things, but actually at a different time. So between the three witnesses, we're talking about child sex abuse being carried out by MPs and other key figures in the British establishment over 3 separate decades, over an incredible period of time. And what's particularly interesting about Darren, the third witness, whose story we broke just this weekend, is that he says that he was trafficked to Dolphin Square by Peter Wrighton. He was long regarded as a sort of expert and specialist in childcare. The irony is just unbelievable. He's in fact a paedophile, a major figure in the Paedophile Information Exchange, a sort of campaign group for paedophile rights, I suppose you could say, that operated here in the UK. And indeed, he'd been convicted of possession of obscene images of children. And that conviction was in 1992. And the period we're talking about when Darren was trafficked, well, along with other boys, aged anything between 14 and 17, that all happened in 1993, the year after his conviction. And what's remarkable about this particular witness is it really evidences something that was said by Tom Watson, an opposition MP in the House of Commons 2 years ago, when he put a question to the Prime Minister, David Cameron, saying, why was it that when Peter Wrighton was investigated in 1992, that various leads that led, he said, to the top of British politics, why was it not pursued? Why was that investigation closed down? And what we have here is evidence that this guy, who was convicted of an offence, but where it would seem the police investigation was curtailed, was engaged in the most horrendous activities in terms of trafficking boys to be abused in the most awful way. I mean, we're talking about the infliction of torture along with the sexual abuse. And this really is a scandal that is slowly being uncovered, and essentially being uncovered by Extra, a relatively new investigative website. It's been going now for 3 years, and we've been publishing material on this story for 2 years. And it's a story really that the media over here in Britain had long failed to uncover. And really we forced the British media to follow in our wake, and the story has been running pretty big here in the UK, but it's entirely as a consequence of the work that we've done over the last 2 years on this extraordinary story.
We're talking to Mark Watts from XRO News. Go to xronews.com, and we have live Twitter feeds, and this is questions. Some of our fans of Black Tower Radio, they Twitter in their questions. This comes from Michael Daniels. And he writes, was Prince Andrew involved in any of the Westminster pedophilia, or are they separate incidents? Question from Michael Daniels on Twitter for Mark Watts.
Yeah, that's a good question. I can understand where that's coming from. In fact, it's quite separate. What we have been looking at is a network of paedophiles at the top of the British establishment, which involves politicians from all three main political parties here in the UK, along with other prominent figures. We've exposed, for example, a former deputy head of MI6, who is now dead, who was part of that network, and specifically he was sexually abusing boys at Dolphin Square. So a whole range of figures. But the royal family is sort of separate from this, but it does connect. We did do a story about some of the documents that went missing from the Home Office, including the Dickens dossier, and we managed to find out that in amongst this material were allegations raised by the mother of, from memory, it was a 16-year-old boy, allegations that her son has been sexually abused while working at Buckingham Palace, specifically in the kitchens. Now, it was unclear who exactly was supposed to have carried out the abuse, but the implication was we're talking about staff who worked at Buckingham Palace. So already, in terms of the material we've published, it has touched the royal family in that way.
Yeah. Talking to Mark Watts, editor-in-chief. Mark Watts is the editor-in-chief of XRO. Go to xronews.com. And another question for you from Curtis Green. Curtis Green tweets in at Black Tower Radio. Question for you. Does your investigations lead you to any suspects in the U.S. and Canada? And we were talking before the show about a character, Aquina, who was convicted of some atrocities as well. And we've also had Kevin Annette on the show, talks about mass graves in Canada. This coming from Curtis Green. Does your investigations lead you to any suspects in the USA and Canada?
Not exactly yet, but one of the person who I just mentioned, the former deputy head of MI6, who is now dead, he was for a time Britain's envoy to Canada, and one of the, shall we say, peculiar aspects of the story was the way in which he had attempted to recruit the 16-year-old lad who it seemed he'd met at Buckingham Palace, because this guy, Peter Heyman, was actually a friend of the Queen's. He tried to recruit him over to join him in Canada, and the mother of the 16-year-old boy intervened to stop it. So worried was she about this character, and it turns out that Heyman was a member of the Paedophile Information Exchange and was a paedophile. So that has a Canadian connection, but of course he's actually a British figure. And we haven't really looked into this, but we certainly, our understanding is that there are questions about Heyman's activities in Canada. I think that's something that is worth investigating. We're certainly aware of general allegations about the connections, the sort of international connections between what we've been uncovering in Britain and elsewhere, and we haven't so far established anything definitive about that.
It's very fascinating, too, and an important point to remember, our listeners, how many children go missing in the United States. It is fascinating when you start to look at the numbers of children that are being taken away from their homes. Of course, we have the history of the Native Americans, and there was institutionalized kidnap, apparently, justified kidnap, even here in the United States, taking away Native American children from their homes and including them in this worldwide sex trafficking ring.
Franklin scandal we've had here.
Franklin scandal.
5,200 Pentagon employees a couple of years ago were caught with child porn on their computer. Nothing ever was followed up in the media. We never heard about it since. But, I mean, I've read reports out of the UK media that Scotland Yard is currently investigating 5 separate VIP pedophile rings. It's hard to believe that there's 5 separate VIP pedophile rings. I mean, there's not many people that rich that can afford to live this sort of lifestyle. So this is a select group of people with very famous people involved in it, like Jimmy Savile. How does Jimmy Savile fit into all this? I mean, does he have something to do with all of these rings? Are all of these rings connected? How does this exactly work, Mark?
Well, that's an interesting point. We actually generally on Extra talk about a network of MP paedophiles, a network of VIP paedophiles. And we use the word network in reference to rings, trying to convey, if you like, how it really works. It isn't a simple ring. It's an interconnected network of paedophiles. And I think it's fair to say that there is one sort of area that tends to focus in the celebrity world. There's a separate one that tends to focus on the political world and in a world of people with real power in the UK, and then separately what you might call the sort of criminal underworld of this sort of paedophile supply of boys and so on. But these things are not separate. They interconnect and they overlap. And in fact, one abuse survivor talked to us about how he sees it as interlocking rings. So it's a kind of complex network that does connect, it seems, everything from MPs, intelligence figures, military figures, celebrities, who all share this predilection and have all, in essence, networked.
Yeah.
And you were asking right at the beginning about how these abuse parties worked. I mean, they were simply parties that took place at Dolphin Square and other locations in central London. And, you know, the way it's been described to us is they were kind of start off as normal parties, sometimes dinner parties, sometimes just sort of parties revolving around drink and so on. And then as the night progressed, there were often women at these parties, but they would leave, and it would sort of, as it were, change in atmosphere when it came time to carry out abuse, which would actually take place on the whole in separate rooms, bedrooms, sometimes themed rooms. At these abuse parties, you'd have a combination of these different kinds of people. I mean, one of the witnesses we talked to has become known as Nick. Obviously, we're not using real names here. And he's a crucial witness because he alleges that he saw 3 murders take place. Not actually at Dolphin Square, but nonetheless carried out by members of this network, and the police are right now investigating this and taking it extremely seriously. They've publicly said that they regard these quite extraordinary allegations to be credible. Indeed, they believe them to be true.
Yeah.
Now, he talked about how he in fact was abused by Peter Heyman, that diplomat and ex-intelligence official that I talked about. He knew the guy's name, but he was quite open about his name, but he actually assumed he was an MP because he spent so much of his time mixing with MPs, and it was after that to tell him, no, he ain't an MP. he was something quite different. But that was the atmosphere. That he knew he was very powerful, just got that impression. But he actually thought he was an MP because he mixed with other MPs.
It's important to point out, I just want to point out one thing. I'm going to digress for 1 second because, people do ask me about, like I know, they should be asking you, of course, but, why? Why does this happen among the elite? And I point out one thing. It's how many times, I would say 2 times a week, Jake, Louisiana, it just happened in Louisiana, pedophile ring, right? You have
Disney World,
yeah,
not too long
Disney
ago.
World not too long ago, right here. What people ask me, why does it happen among the elite? And I say it's a symptom of mankind. It's not some strange infatuation or symptom of just the elite. This is something that's happening right here in America, in Louisiana, with the broken down houses and the Coca-Cola and the Xboxes there, and it's happening in this kind of morally bankrupt world. And Mark Watts is describing an elite organization of people that are able to live out these sort of fantasies. All right? So this isn't a symptom of the elite. This is a symptom of mankind that's happening. It's an important point to remember. This isn't something where we can point our...
I really strongly agree with you there. It is absolutely all kinds of people carry out these kind of activities.
Yeah.
All kinds of people, all stratas of society, all types of professions, everything. And I think it's important to remember that because, particularly for abuse survivors, people who suffered this kind of abuse, the vast majority of them have suffered abuse. It might be in the family, it might be at school, teachers, adults they've come across in very ordinary lives. And it would be wrong for anyone to get carried away with the idea that predominantly where, the sexual abuse of children, most victims are victims of prominent people. That's not how it is at all. And it's important to remember that because the vast majority of people who suffer this abuse have not suffered it at the hands of MPs or prominent people. It's just ordinary people of all types.
Go to XRO News. Yeah, continue. I'm sorry to interrupt. Continue.
I was going to say that I think, nonetheless, the reason we focus, particularly in the political world and the power, because it's the most extreme abuse of power. Because if we have a society, and increasingly looks like, I'm afraid we for a long time have had in the UK at least, a society where people at the very top of society think it's fine to go around and sexually abuse children, then what does that mean for everything else? And what does that mean in terms of the structures that are supposed to be safeguarding children or caring for children in care and so on and so forth? Perhaps that explains why it is that we had such a highly regarded expert in the field who turned out in fact to be a paedophile. So although it's not ordinary experience of people who suffered at the hands of paedophiles to be suffering, to be attacked by prominent people, it is nonetheless very significant, I think, that prominent people in Britain have been doing this, because I think it has all sorts of knock-on consequences for children across the piece.
Go to xronews.com. Xro, which is a Latin word for, I believe, to dig up. To dig up, right? Is that Xro, right?
Yeah.
Xro.
That's right. That's Latin to dig up.
xronews.com. And the one thing that I love that I'm going to point out here is commentary. And we're going to talk about this panel for inquiry into child sex abuse. Now you have people here. You have a first-person account. This is by Becky. And this is people. This is a woman who is describing her abuse to you. Now you're dealing with people's sensitive information. People feel comfortable coming to you. She writes, "Sexual abuse was my normality from the age of 3 or 4. I was not aware that it was abuse until much later. When I was aware of it, I still did not believe that I had the right or the opportunity to escape it. There have been many times when I wished I was dead. It took 2 years of professional involvement to begin to challenge these beliefs enough for me to escape. Last year I did. It was my counselor who suggested that I engage in the inquiry. It was to be an exercise in empowerment." Okay. Talk about the panel. Talk about Theresa May. Do you see Theresa May as being a shill, as we say, who is simply trying to squash the situation? What is the panel? What is the panel, Mark Watts?
Okay. Well, what happened was, as I say, we've been publishing a series of disclosures about this, about the Westminster Paedophile Network, but also some disclosures about sexual abuse at certain schools, at certain religious institutions, and it culminated in a small group, a cross-party group of MPs to make a call for an overarching inquiry into child sex abuse in the UK. And what was called for is what's known as an independent panel, which is a certain kind of inquiry where you have a panel of people who are supposed to be independent of governments or any other institution, who look into something. Now, the history here is we had the Hillsborough football disaster many years ago, and for a long time the official story was that it was essentially the fans' fault and it was hogwash. And what happened was an independent panel inquiry was set up, which really managed very successfully to get to the truth of the matter, which turned out to be that it was basically the police had conspired to misrepresent what had happened, to shift the blame from themselves to the fans, and so on and so forth. So it was an enormously successful inquiry at getting to the truth of a terrible conspiracy that had happened.
Sure.
And it contrasts with judicial inquiries, which often reach conclusions that are quite frankly perverse, fly in the face of the evidence when it doesn't suit the establishment in one way or another. So the call was for a panel inquiry, and that in the end was successful, not least because a lot of our Twitter followers had embarked on a campaign of tweeting at other MPs to see whether they would join the initial small group of 7 that made the call. And very quickly we had 146 MPs backing this call for an inquiry. So the Home Secretary, Theresa May, announced that this inquiry would happen, but it has been dogged with problems. In particular, there was a succession of 2 chairwomen who were chosen, and in each case there were problems over conflicts of interest, and in each case in the end had to stand down. So as things stand, we have a panel where we don't have a chair for it, and there are a lot of questions over its future direction. And the abuse survivor you were just talking about there, known as Becky, she wrote a commentary piece for us because she was becoming alarmed, like the vast majority of abuse survivors have talked to us about what looks like a campaign to undermine this panel inquiry before it's really even begun work.
Sure.
And, we'll have to see whether it will really take off. But I think a lot of people, most abuse survivors, need to believe that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
This is a solution. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, I mean, it's so great that this seems like a real solution. I mean, she writes here, "For the first time, I was able to tell the truth of what happened to me as a child and then a teenager." Okay? For people that are abused, now this person has this chance to make real change in the government, and we're going to make real change. This is so therapeutic on a level, and it's so positive for these people that have gone through these things, And to think that this is something that, like you said, is being attacked and being dissolved, and now here we are in kind of the bureaucratic mess, it seems a real tragedy to me. Because it seems like the only thing that will help a person like Becky is to be able to air these things for real change. For real change. Going after the bully. Jake? Going after the bully for a minute,
Sure. I mean, we're not talking about one or two individual cases here. We're talking about a real systemic problem within the UK government, within the BBC. I mean, we're talking about snuff films being made where children are murdered on film. I mean, this is by VIP pedophiles. I mean, this is the most horrific sort of situation, I mean, I've ever heard of in a Western nation. I've never heard of something this widespread in this, I mean, snuff films made with children.
Well, the violent nature of it is, it's disturbing, but we're talking to Mark.
I mean,
go ahead.
That is right. The widespread nature of it is right, but one of the things that's interesting about Becky, challenging with what we were talking about earlier, she was abused initially within the family, and then subsequently within an organised religious setting. So in her case, it wasn't. We're not talking about VIPs, but one of the things is that what she found is as she tried to report it to the police, and this is a frequent complaint, has been a frequent complaint about how it's gone over many years in the UK, is people are not believed. It's not taken seriously. It is not investigated properly.
Yeah.
So a major part of what Becky has been saying is that when this town inquiry set up, they had consultative meetings, they're still having a series of consultative meetings with survivors around the country, and she went to one of these meetings to see what she was going to make of it, like a lot of abuse survivors has. And in common with the majority of abuse survivors, they've been very impressed by this panel. They felt that the panel members are serious, are determined, do want to get to the bottom of it. And in fact, it includes, in my view, quite rightly, it includes two survivors of abuse. So they bring that perspective of, how on earth are we going to go about this in a way that is possible for abuse survivors to come and give evidence to us. And Becky is an example of someone who was so impressed that she made an amazing step for her that she could actually trust in this panel. And in fact, she started engaging with a couple of its members. I think she talked to them at the end of a meeting and then subsequently had an email exchange. That was very early days. But she felt able, finally, to actually start talking fully to someone about what had happened, having not been able to do that with the police. And so what her big worry is that having seen this campaign to undermine the panel, and we broke a story before Christmas that basically it looked like the panel was going to be scrapped, it's just an enormous setback for someone like her. So she's, re-traumatized by that prospect.
Yeah, the police. She does mention the police as well. You expect the police to be there to help you out. The Catholic Church. How does the Catholic Church fit into this whole thing? I don't know.
Is there any religious angle to this? Is there a Church of England or a Catholic Church, any tie-in to this whole thing, Mark?
There certainly is. I mean, there's both. We run stories about particular Catholic order schools known as the Salesians, which we reported on how what was then a secret police investigation was opened up into allegations surrounding that Catholic order of schools. And also with the Church of England, we actually got hold of a letter that was written by the current Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, in which he talks about, it's effectively a frank admission that the Church of England has a massive problem with, examples of clergy sexually abusing children over many, many years. Now, Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, is relatively new in the post. I've remembered perhaps a couple of years he's been in the post, and he's sort of learning what on earth has been going on. and I think he's genuinely been taken aback. And it seems to us he's committed to, for the truth to be got out. Now, there was a time, I think, when we were doing those stories that the government was sort of putting pressure, saying to the church, both the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church here in the UK, that you need to have an inquiry into what's been going on. And their answer was, well, hang on, it's not just our institutions, it's many institutions in the UK, quite reasonably. There needs to be an inquiry into everything, not just our institutions, but into all institutions. And that's actually what we've got. It will, it's supposed to be an overarching inquiry, so it's supposed to be looking at all institutions in the UK. And we're talking about failure by central government, in particular the Home Office, local government, the criminal justice system over here, including the police and the prosecuting authorities, and indeed, it has to be said, the media, both in terms of paedophilia at the BBC, Julie Savile we've talked about, and there are other figures. But also there's this final question I'm coming to isn't a question for the inquiry, but it's an issue nonetheless, which is why the media has failed to uncover this for so long.
Well, I mean, of course, the media is controlled. Well, we have CNN, don't we, Jake? We've interviewed a few people that worked at CNN. Yeah?
We sure have.
Bunch of shills over there. They're not going to... Of course, they know who's paying their bills. We all know who's paying the bills here. There's one guy. By the way, if you go all the way up the ladder, there's one guy. We don't know who he is. He might be a Rothschild. We don't know. Who knows who's up there? We're talking to Mark Watts, editor-in-chief of XRO. You got to go to xronews.com. And you have to look at the work that he's doing, because you're doing real investigative work, and you do pride yourself in a world where we just kind of reprint things and retweet, and it's all but XRO News, you don't do that there. You don't.
No, it's original journalism, that's right. And most newsrooms in London, I'm sure it's the same in New York, and I'm afraid in a lot of Western countries, journalists spend their time rewriting wire copies, we call it. So this is copy that comes through from the wire services, or perhaps rewriting press releases or attending press briefings by spin doctors. It's not real information. It's like the McDonald's of news, and I'm afraid that's what people are increasingly being fed by.
Man, it is.
By the mainstream media.
It's bad. It's
interesting because most of the journalists who work for XRO, in fact, pretty much all of them, come from a background. They're all from national newspapers. They're all from mainstream media. We have, a couple of younger ones who are sort of a much earlier stage of their careers, but overwhelmingly, people do come, in fact, from the mainstream media. But of course, actually allowed to investigate things properly and thoroughly. And we were talking about Darren, the third witness, whose story we told just this weekend, with more going up on the site earlier today. A reporter who principally works on that, a guy called Tim Wood, he spent 5 months on that, and I'm afraid there aren't many, if any, newspapers in London that would allow someone to spend that kind of time on a story, and I'm afraid investigations do take time.
Yeah, and you do take the time, and you go to XRO News, go to xronews.com. You're interviewing these people, Mark Watts. You have a heart. If anybody has a heart, you do. You're talking to these people. I just gotta know, though, for my own personal reason, how did you get into this? What brought you to this? The cutting edge.
This particular story, you mean?
Well, you gotta sum it up. And how did you get here? How did you get here so that you're sitting and you're inviting people? The way I see it is that people feel comfortable coming to XRO News.
They feel safe.
They feel safe there. How did that happen? Did you set out to have XRO News be a place where people could feel safe to come with their stories? Was that your philosophy from the get-go?
It's not. We didn't set up XRO in order to do this story. We set up XRO to do investigative journalism, to hold power to account. And actually, the start of it was we had some information that related specifically, and we hadn't even talked about it, to a specific location for child sex abuse that operated in the country for the great and the good, in inverted commas, a place called Elm Guest House. in southwest London, which essentially operated as a paedophile brothel, and MPs would go there along with other establishment figures. In fact, the police have officially confirmed that a Liberal MP, now dead, Cyril Smith, attended the place. So we started with our investigation there, and essentially what we've done is simply followed the evidence. As evidence has come to light, we've followed the trail, and we soon realised that while Elm Gas Test was indeed a very significant story, we soon realised it was just one tentacle, it was just one location where this was going on. And, you know, we've just followed the evidence trail, and we've ended up in a situation where people will come forward to us, abuse survivors and the other whistleblowers, because they feel
it's a haven, That's a
go to the police or other authorities.
That's a real blessing, by the way. And at XRO News, like you said, it started as an investigative, but the real blessing, it seems to me anyway, this is my own job. I'm just projecting my own ideas, but the real blessing here is that it is a haven, that people do feel comfortable. That is the real blessing here. If there's a place where people can feel comfortable telling their stories, there's no other place like that, Mark Watts. There's no place like that in America. There's no place like that I see anywhere. Okay, so what you have that you've built there...
It's a very beautiful thing.
It's a beautiful thing. I'm just saying. I don't see it anywhere. I mean, I don't know. What are you going to go... I don't know, Huffington Post? We're going to read more about, I don't know.
Kim
Kardashian's... Yeah, there's nothing there for
you. What's really great about it, I think, is that it's changing other things. So, you know, I just said that people, you know, have long history not trusting the police, and quite frankly, with good reason. Well, when we ran that first story about Dolphin Square, which was in July last year, the police approached us and said, we'd like to speak to those two witnesses. Can you put us in touch? Now, of course, we wouldn't just pass their details. These are confidential sources. Yeah. What we did is we contacted the two witnesses and said, look, we've been approached. Do you want to talk to the police? Now, one of them didn't, but one of them did. The guy who's known as Nick, he did. And this led to the investigations going on right now into the murder of 3 boys. One of them, according to Nick, carried out by an MP. A second one carried out in the presence of, in front of, a former Conservative cabinet minister. The MP who's alleged to have carried out the murder was also a Conservative MP, which is the governing party right now. And so it changed the police's approach. And I have to say, Nick is obviously, you know, really pleased about what XRO has done. I mean, he finds it all very difficult because it means reliving these terrible experiences. But his experience so far of having dealt with the police is a positive one. He thinks the police are taking it seriously. And he's happy about the way he dealt it. And that's a remarkable change.
All right, Mark. Before you go, we've gotten a bunch of different variations of the same question for you on our Twitter feed at Black Tower Radio. If you guys have any questions for today's guest, Mark Watts, or any future guests, go ahead and tweet us in your questions at Black Tower Radio, and we'll try to get them in on air. But we've gotten a whole bunch of pretty much a variation of the same question. Do you believe that a prime minister or a member of their cabinet were involved in any of these things, or covered up any of these things, or knew any of these things were going on?
What we can say so far is we believe there were two former cabinet ministers who were themselves involved in the sexual abuse of children in the UK.
All right, well, then I guess we're just going to have to wait for those things to be sussed up, because we're going to have to get those names at some point. But at this time, we don't want to have it be, you know, any kind of legal matters. We can't say the names anymore. No more speculation, Jake. XRO News is doing the good.
He's a good journalist. Yeah. You know, he's not gonna sloppily put out a name and. Well, I mean, he doesn't want to put himself in any legal situation.
We have had sloppy conspiracy theorists on the show, though.
We sure have.
But this isn't even conspiracy. This is good work. Mark Watts, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. It's an honor to talk to you.
Thank you very much. And it's great that the more the word spreads about it, the better.
Well, you got us in upstate New York. I don't know. How often do you come over here to the States? I mean, what's going? Do you want to come visit us? You can come into studio sometime if you'd like. No.
I'll try and take you up on that one of these days.
Yeah, one of these days. Mark Watts. Go to xronews.com. Editor-in-chief, co-founder of the FOIA Center, specialized in research using open access laws such as the Freedom of Information Act. And he's a journalist, author, and television presenter. Just go to xronews.com and look at the good work that they're doing. Mark Watts, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Thank you.